So let me point out one thing I think Deborah didn't mention, that 3 or 4 judges so far have said it's okay.
8.
8 judges so far have said it's okay.
8-0.
8-0. And then what's coming up is there's 7 members on the next one. So 15 people, eventually. That is going to be argued in March, is that correct?
We don't have an argument date yet.
Okay, so sometime before...
Sometime in the spring.
Okay, so now you know what the timetable is, more or less. Another point I want to make is that legislatures can and do pass laws to change things. So even after everything is done, the New York State Legislature, which has shown absolutely no interest in gas drilling whatsoever, once they passed that horizontal drilling implementing legislation in 2008, they have stayed about as far away from any legislation as it's possible to get. It's hot stuff, it's controversial, and it's not clear, what's the right thing to do. So the likelihood of the legislature stepping in at this point, I think, is pretty slim. On the other hand, and that could happen in other states too. And that's what I wanted to mention. Joe Heath is my good friend also. I met Joe, he started in shale gas things. He says in 2008, I think 2009, I'm not sure, we haven't had a discussion about it. Doesn't matter, he doesn't remember that far back. I probably don't either. Anyway, he's the general counsel for the Onondaga Nation, which is in the county of Onondaga, is that right? Onondaga County? And one of the unique features of the nation is that their watershed is outside their territory. That is, they're here, the watershed is out here. And so they have a strong interest in protecting the quality of their water. And their position has been that they don't like hydraulic fracturing. Joe's worked on, has given lease workshops. It turns out that, once you get into this law stuff, it gets very, very complicated. Just because your lease has expired, you think, the termination date is up, it was yesterday, that's it, it's over. Now you can go out and renegotiate, or now they can't get you, however you want to think about that. It's not that simple, and sometimes very complicated processes are necessary. For example, don't cash the check, and that may not even be enough. So he's worked on many aspects of shale gas drilling. His role tonight is to talk about the politics. That is, Deborah talked about the can you, and Joe will talk about some aspects of the how would you if you wanted to. Joe?
Well, my first job is to hand out the quiz for what Deborah just told me. I hope everybody was paying attention. Seriously, we're very fortunate to have Deborah Goldberg here tonight to be able to explain the law. And we're also very fortunate that she's going to be leading the argument in the Court of Appeals. We have a couple of other very, very knowledgeable lawyers here tonight, and I will get to them in a minute. But what we're talking about is home rule. And as a former trial lawyer, I try to pick some of my show and tell carefully. This is kind of, to me, exemplifies the problem between the industry and what's going on in our towns. And I chose this for a couple of reasons. My father drove bus in northern Oswego County for close to 40 years. We always were worried about whether or not he would get home. And my brother-in-law now drives bus in near Syracuse, New York. So this is kind of exemplifies the problem that when you bring these large industries into your town, the juxtaposition of what we're trying to protect against. And what I hope to cover tonight, what I will cover tonight is I want to talk to you some about the Binghamton case because it's unique in the 4 lower court cases. And most of what you've heard about the Binghamton decision is just dead wrong, because the landowner coalitions are mischaracterizing what the case was about and what the ruling was. And we will come back to that. I was fortunate enough to help the two lawyers, Helen and David Slacky, who are over here, who helped the city and then took the case through the lower court and had it all ready to be argued. So we're going to talk about Binghamton and show you how, in fact, the Binghamton decision strengthened the home rule jurisprudence that we're moving forward on. So that'll be some legal talk, but much more just trying to make sure that everybody understands that. Also, I now live in Preble, New York, which is northern Cortland County, about 45 miles north of here. I was hoping that when we were building up to scheduling this event, that I'd be able to crow about how we already had a ban, because we had a town board meeting set for February 10th, and the ban is all queued up to be voted on. But our town lawyer, who we'll just say is less than perfect, forgot an incredibly important environmental form that had to come in order to get the ban voted on. And so we had to schedule a special town board meeting next Monday, the 24th. And we'll explain how much work that was, and I hope there's some lessons for your own towns. And then just briefly at the end, I always like to remind us that we need to break the fossil fuel habit, that it's not acceptable to be thinking that we can switch from one fossil fuel to another, and we have to stop the huge infrastructure expenses that are coming at us from all directions in New York State and really work towards sustainable, renewable energy. So, the city of Binghamton, and probably some of you are from Binghamton, so you know this. When Matt Ryan was the mayor, and his term just ended at the end of December, and he saw that there had been an election a couple of years ago that was going to significantly change the composition of the city council, he decided that he wanted to do as much as he could to protect the city of Binghamton in a very short period of time. I'm probably going to not get all of this accurate and get corrected by my friends later on, which is often necessary. But it is not a zoning amendment ban. It was not a zoning amendment ban because there just wasn't enough time to go through the many elaborate steps, and I'll come back to those when we talk about Preble. There just wasn't enough time. And so it was very much a hybrid, very different than any other town or municipality that I'm aware of. And so some of the preemption arguments, although they tried to raise them, and we'll come back to the very, very clear ruling on preemption, but it's a very distinct situation. And what's important to remember about the Binghamton law was that it had a 2-year sunset provision. It was enacted at the end of December 2011 and designed to end by its own terms in December of 2013. And despite this lawsuit, and despite the ruling of the lower court judge, who's second cousin to one of our least progressive state senators, that law was in full effect for the entire 2 years that it was designed to be in effect. And so this lawsuit had zero impact on the protection of the city of Binghamton that the mayor helped institute. So that's really the most important thing that I want to say. The law ended on its own terms, and I'll explain more why that happened. But the first thing I want to do is, remind us that we don't want this next to our elementary school. And we want to have the right to keep it from going next to our elementary school. That's what we're talking about tonight. We don't want it next to the retirement home. We want to be able to say that you can't do industrial drilling in our town or in sections of our town because we have the right to prevent that. And that's what home rule is about. Here's there's one paragraph in the entire lower court decision, the Supreme Court. In New York, we have the lowest level trial court is called Supreme Court. Then, as Deborah said, the Appellate Division, and then the Court of Appeals. The Supreme Court ruled this is the only mention of preemption in the entire decision, and I'm going to read it to you because it's very important, because what you've been told is that they won the Binghamton decision, and it was a blow against home rule. I think when you see what was really said there, you'll see how much you need to filter what you hear from the other side, because they're willing to say just about anything, and I think this shows that. So the judge ruled recently 2 cases have been decided regarding the preemption that Deborah so well explained to us of local laws pertaining to gas exploration, storage, and extraction. Those cases, Dryden, decided by Judge Rumsey in Cortland County, and Middlefield, decided by Judge Serio in Madison County, in well-reasoned, well-founded decisions, determined that the Environmental Conservation Law 23-303, Subdivision 2, that's the one that the other side always uses, saying that you're preempted, does not supersede local government's right to regulate the use of land within their jurisdiction. The state law does not preempt local law. The court adopts the reasoning of those cases and holds that the local law is not superseded by the state law. Very important wording, very clearly strengthening the concept of the right of home rule as opposed to what you've heard about it. So that decision came down in the early summer of 2012, I think, and it had other aspects of the decision, because what the judge said was, the city has the right to try to outlaw industrial drilling and related activities. You just didn't do it procedurally correct under this hybrid method that you were trying to get in place in short term. And we don't really need to go into the details of what he ruled there. We think that he was pretty wrong on a very essential part of that ruling, and that's why we work so hard on the appeal. Actually, Helen worked so hard on the appeal. So both sides appeal because they got a little bit of something, we got a little bit of something. And the way, when you sue a municipality in New York, there's a state procedural pocket that it fits into. It's called an Article 78. That's part of the civil practice laws and rules. And when a municipality appeals a decision under an Article 78, they get an automatic stay. And so even though he said the law was not properly enacted, it remained in place and it remained in effect because of that automatic stay that comes to the municipality in an Article 78. So the law started in January of 2012 and ran its natural course of the 2 years while the appeal was pending. Now, of course, the other side knew of that automatic stay and tried to rush the appeal through. They tried to grab the appeal and say that they had the right to lead the appeal as opposed to the municipality. And Helen, to her credit, knocked them out of the box on that. They wasted a bunch of months because they were not entitled to lead the appeal. And it took some really deep research and some very, very, impressive legal work in order to beat them back on that. And so briefs and the records were exchanged, and we were getting ready to argue the appeal early this year. The law remained in place, and it then died a natural death at the end of December 2013. And those of you who live here know that Matt Ryan's term ended. He was term limited. And you have a new mayor. One of the first things the new mayor did was end the appeal, which is kind of questionable because it wasn't costing the city anything. But he ordered the appeal withdrawn. So that's the end of the case. A few days later, he announced, and some of you may be more in tune with local political events than I am up there, but he announced he does not want fracking in the city of Binghamton. Now, how he's going to accomplish that protection, he hasn't explained, because when he said he doesn't want fracking, he also said, well, we think it's a little too early to be enacting a ban or a moratorium because the state is still not decided on whether or not they're going to ever allow fracking or industrial drilling. So we'll just wait and see what the state does. We think that's a risky legal philosophy, but we weren't asked. So that's where it is right now. The appeal is over. We won't get to test whether or not the legal ruling that he used on whether or not it was properly done and what the law should be around that hybrid procedure that was used. But what's really important to take away here is that the ruling by the lower court strengthened home rule and that the Binghamton law was never struck down to the extent that it always stayed in place and it ran its natural life. So that's the Binghamton decision. Now I want to talk about what we're doing up in Preble in northern Cortland County. So first, I think it's kind of important to understand the town a little bit because most people are not really familiar with the beautiful downtown Preble because there isn't any downtown Preble. And I have some maps here that I'll show in a minute. But we're blessed with a number of glacial lakes. It's part of what we call the Tully Valley, which is just to the east of the Finger Lakes. It's just to the east of Atisco Lake, and it's glacially created, and we are lucky enough to live on one of those kettle lakes. They're called kettle lakes because as the glacier receded, pieces of ice fell off the face of the glacier. It was about a mile thick, and then the gravel and everything filled in around it, and where these big pieces of ice lay, there were kettle lakes left. This is looking out of front of our house on Song Lake, one of those glacial lakes. It's a photograph that my wife Tarky took. But you can see why we care about this lake. I think everybody cares about the water bodies that they are lucky enough to be next to. But I asked for a picture that would kind of try to help understand something about Preble. This is a map. It's probably very hard to see. We tried to turn down just these lights. We couldn't do that. But here are the lakes up here. This is the county line between Cortland and Onondaga County, the town of Tully to the north. There are other lakes here. I think I have one of those maps here. This is Song Lake. You can see how it's about a mile long and how that piece of ice formed that lake. We're lucky enough to live there and looking south that way. This is Tully Lake, another kettle lake. Tully drains to the south and creates the west branch of the Teofnioga River. We will come back to this map if I don't repeat it, because this little area here, this yellow area, was a proposed propane facility that we learned about in September and that I'll come back and talk about. So this is the town of Tully. This red line is a pipeline that we just helped Millennium understand they shouldn't build. It was proposed last May, and in December they announced that they weren't going to build at least the northern half of that pipeline. This was a 30-inch pipeline that they intended to build to link the Millennium down here in Broome County to the Tennessee Gas Pipeline up in Onondaga County. It would have run through between these two kettle lakes. I think we got a close-up of that. So this is Green Lake, one of the northernmost of these glacial lakes. This is a very large wetland that doesn't show up here, and it would have run right between those two lakes. Green drains into Tully and goes south there. So that's one of the things we've been doing in our area is fighting pipeline. The other thing about trouble that's very important to understand is that almost all of the citizens who live there, we live on top of a sole source aquifer, a very shallow, glacially created aquifer about 20 to 30 feet below the ground. And this purple area indicates the aquifer and its recharge area. When we have our well here, we have no other choice. We either get our water out of that aquifer or we don't get water. One mistake in that aquifer, and 50,000 people in Portland County will not be able to have water. So that's another very important feature that the town rallies around. So we have some small lakes. It's a very heavily farmed community yet. I was just noticing as we drove down it again today, we have a lot of family farms left, which is very rare in upstate New York. In Oswego County, where I grew up, I worked on farms growing up, probably about half a dozen of them. Not one of them are there anymore. That's, I think, reflective of the fact that the land, the soil in Cortland Valley, as a result of the glacier activity, is really good farming land. So we have lakes, we have the farms, and we have the sole source aquifer. Those are the things that we all really try to protect in our town. So in order to pass a zoning amendment ban, you have to do a lot of work. And you have to be very patient, and you have to really take your time. In fact, in our town, I think one of the reasons that we've been successful is that we've been active on environmental issues for a couple of decades, and particularly over the last decade. My wife is the president of the Lake Association that we live on. She's also the leader of the Kettle Lakes Association, and we've presented between that association and some of our fracking work, we presented close to a dozen educational workshops in the recent years. And people come to understand that we're really trying to share information with them. The other thing that's happened in the last 10 years is that we've elected some different members of the town board. I know some of you have worked in your towns, and that's not an easy thing to do. But as we know, town boards have 5 people on them. In many towns, we find 3, 4, 5 people with leases sitting on the town board, and it's sometimes very hard to convince them that they need to look beyond their personal interests and think more about the entire town. So over the years, we have learned about the system of, instead of primaries, we have caucuses. And I know some of you are learning about this as we have. And you have to be aware of how the caucus works, how you can try to bring more people to the caucus than they can. And we're very lucky to have a town supervisor that's, within the last 10 years, I can't remember exactly how long Jim's been in, but a very different town supervisor than we had 10 years ago. And we also have elected a couple of board members that have really changed the composition of the town. And so that has been very, very critical in order to get the town board to listen to the citizens and to enact the zoning amendments that will be voted on next Monday. So that's one thing that we've done. We've been at this particular, we have a moratorium in place. The moratorium was done with the help of David Slocky, who took a look at our zoning amendment and recommended those sections that needed to be changed in order to ban all industrial drilling and all related activities. And we started that process probably most intensely about 1.5 years ago. And we also continued to do educational workshops. We did a lease termination workshop particularly aimed at one of the town board members who had a lease and thought that his lease was still active when in fact it wasn't. We also invited, and were lucky enough to get Tony and Graffia to come in and do another presentation. And it's very hard not to be moved by Tony, most of us know that. And then we started pushing the town board to consider a moratorium. So in order to do that, you have to have, I think we've had 3 public hearings already. This is not something you sneak through your town, and that's the difference that I'm really trying to create. Because when I finish with this, I'll talk about how easy it is for some of these towns to enact these resolutions. So the first thing we had to do was have a public hearing on the draft. We also, the town supervisor then appointed a committee, and clearly the composition of that committee was carefully chosen because you could find, and he took 2 people off each of our boards, the zoning board of appeal, the planning board, and the town board. And, you know, obviously the disposition of those people had an impact on how well they were willing to take a look at why the zoning code needed to be strengthened. We had a couple of meetings. Again, David came in and helped them understand why we were recommending the amendments and how they made common sense. We also did a little cleaning up of the zoning code. Most zoning codes are kind of patched together and needed some definition changes and things like that. It's a very comprehensive set of planning. And then last September, we kind of got a very interesting boost. So we had the moratorium pretty well ready. And then at the end of September, we read in the Cortland paper that the state and the governor's office announced a grant of money, several $100,000, to build a railroad spur in the town of Preble for a proposed propane storage facility. No one in the town had heard about it. They never asked the town board, the town supervisor, anybody except the one landowner whose land they were trying to buy. And they kept being very, very secret about it, really playing into our hands to a large extent. And within 2 weeks, the town board asked us to prepare a moratorium against large-scale propane facilities. What we finally ferreted out of these people, after several FOIA requests, Freedom of Information requests, is that they had pretty much picked a spot next to the railroad track. So, this is Route 81 that runs through the town. This is the railroad track. And this little yellow area here is where they wanted to put above-ground storage of 720,000 gallons of liquid propane. The largest tanks that you'll see around that companies use to distribute are 30,000 gallons. So 720,000 gallons is a large-scale industrial propane facility, particularly, gotta get trained here, this close to that sort of fragile glacial wetlands and lakes and rivers. Propane is condensed from a gas to a liquid. A gallon of liquid propane will produce 270 gallons of gaseous propane. That's a lot of propane to be stored. Now, it's not as much propane as they want to store underneath Watkins Glen and Seneca Lake, but it's way too much propane to be trying to sneak into a town. And the town reacted very, very well. It really, I think, helped us along in the process of this. So, with David's help, we drafted the moratorium to ban large-scale propane facilities above 30,000 gallons, and then presented that to the committee. The committee looked at those and agreed these are the amendments that they want to recommend to the town board. We've had a lot of meetings about this. As I said, there's been 3 public hearings so far. Then, when the town board tentatively accepted it, you then have to send, if you're going to amend your zoning code, there's a section of the state law, the town law, which is a state law, that mandates you have to do other things before you can just amend your zoning code. You have to refer to the county planning department and have them review it. And so we took that step. You also have to notify all the neighboring towns. So you don't just sneak one of these through. Each of these takes time and efforts. The other thing that we did that I should have mentioned much earlier is that we formed a group of concerned citizens in Preble who were against fracking. We knew this from some personal relations, also from some of the lease work that I had done there. And so we had at least about a dozen people who met regularly to work on this with us. And they called town board members and found out where their concerns were. In other words, we really engaged in the democratic process, and I know people are doing this in other towns where they're getting stonewalled, so I don't want to say that we did something superhuman. We had people that would listen to us because of all of those years of work and because of the mutual concerns that we have to protect their farms, the lakes, and the aquifer. So we talked to all the board members. Every vote that we've had so far has been unanimous. And so we'll see how we do on Monday night. The other thing we did was work the media a great deal, so that every time we were doing an event, we would have something in the Cortland paper, which has actually been very progressive against industrial gas drilling and these kinds of attacks on our community. There's also a radio station there that we've worked. There's a local paper in Tully that's been very helpful. In other words, what we did is what you were all trying to do in your towns, which is educate and agitate and organize. And if you're to the point where you want to start looking at your zoning code, there are clearly lawyers like Helen and David that can help you do that correctly. Because as Deborah explained, you have to be very careful how you craft one of these bans or moratoria. If you do it incorrectly, you will violate these case law that we've talked about, and you'll get struck down. In fact, there's some towns where we've seen town lawyer work that was almost, it looks, when you look at it, like either they didn't study hard enough or they particularly tried to craft something that would not stand up in court later on. And I can tell you that there's been some tension between me and the town lawyer over the last couple of years that we've, I think, finally gotten over because the town supervisor helped with that. But that's another person in your town you really have to work with. If you get the wrong town lawyer, this becomes harder. So we've been very fortunate in Pro because they listened to us so far, and because they came to understand that the concerns that we were bringing in were their concerns. When you tell the the dairy farmer on the town board that you can't understand how you farm without water, he begins to nod. And so that's the kind of interaction that we've had with our town board. Now, we've heard about these town resolutions that are portrayed as pro-fracking. That's not the way they're worded, as has been explained. I was in a town to the east of here about a year and a half ago when this movement just started. Those things, some of them are never announced to the public. This town, the town board had met, and most people don't go to the town board meetings. It's something that we've done an awful lot of lately because of a subdivision problem, and we go pretty regularly, and we've also helped the town understand the new expanded provisions of the Freedom of Information Act, which mandates that they're supposed to put an agenda on the town board, on the website beforehand, and make documents available to the public beforehand, or at least at the meeting. And if you need some help working with those, a lot of towns don't quite get that yet. But a lot of town boards just meet, the 5 of them come together, do what they want, and go home. In many instances, without telling the public ever that they're going to even think about a resolution that's in any way taking a position on industrial drilling, they just sneak it in with no notice whatsoever and take a vote right there. Totally undemocratic. I see people nodding their heads. And so when you see people weighing the numbers here, you really need to understand that one can be done in the dark of night, like that, and the other takes a year and a half of public meetings and a lot of work. And so I still say, when I'm out there doing lease workshops, I don't think there's a town in New York that would, if we could have a fair vote among the citizens, that would vote in favor of fracking. One of the things that makes me say that is, in Portland County, we have 48% of our land leased. We did before we started the lease work. I don't know how many of those we've knocked out, but it's scores among hundreds anyway. 48% leased. Now that sounds like it's a pretty even split. When the paper published that map that was put together by our county planning department, by the way, they also explained that only 10% of the landowners had leased that 48%, because they're the large landowners. And that's obviously who these landmen target first. If you get one 640-acre farm, it's a lot better than trying to get 640 individual acres. So 10%. And then if you factor into the equation that at least there are at least as many non-landowning citizens as there are landowning citizens, we've got about 5% of our county leasing half the county. I don't think that if you had a fair vote, that any town would be in favor of it. That's just a personal opinion. But I've been in well over 50 different towns in the last few years. So, let's see what I've skipped over here. Nothing. So that's trouble. I can answer more specific questions. It's a lot of work, but it's very. Each time that I stand up and thank the town board after one of these steps, I remind myself and then how lucky we are that we have a town board that will help unify the town and pull it together in a unanimous way, as opposed to some of the other towns that we've seen struggling with each other and not listening to their citizens. And the next area that I want to talk about is that we're at a crossroads, as we all know. You know, we're kind of playing Nero here, and we're fiddling while the earth is burning. And we're pretending that if we change from coal to make electricity, if we use frack gas, that we'll be better off, and it will be better for the climate and for climate change. Well, it's pretty clear that it's not better. That the leakage of methane is the elephant in the room when it comes to fracking. As most of us know, Bob Hobart and Tony Angrafia have a peer-reviewed study that indicates that a minor percentage of methane leaking makes frack gas worse for climate change when you picture the overall picture of extraction and piping and compressing, because methane is between 85 and 103 times worse for climate change over a 20-year period. They like to water down that number by saying 100 years. We don't have 100 years. If we don't fix this within a lot less than 20 years, history's going to condemn us. And our grandchildren are going to ask us, what were you doing back then? And I know most of you understand that. That's why you're here. That's why you keep working in your towns. But we often hear, oh, you're just against things. Well, no, we're not just against things. We're in favor of saving the planet and the climate as we know it. And the way to do that is to stop building infrastructure, to stop building 30-inch pipelines that will only increase our use of fracked gas, to stop building compressor stations, to stop building storage facilities, and create jobs with sustainable energy. And we can do that. It's being done. Germany is the leader in solar energy. They get a lot less sun than we do. And when you read about how they came to that, they talk about learning from Jimmy Carter. Some of us remember him. So, I'm preaching to the choir here, but every talk I give ends this way. Sustainable, renewable energy, we can do it. Now, this is a small vertical access wind turbine that's been developed in Syracuse, New York. That's the former Hotel Syracuse behind it that we can't figure out a way to keep open. On this side of Warren Street was a business incubator where this small turbine was developed. This one is about 8 feet tall, 8 feet around. It can generate wind, or can generate electricity with about 3 miles an hour of wind. The important thing that this I think exemplifies that one of the answers to sustainability is decentralization. Getting away from big wind, and I have one of those here, getting that individuals can build systems, solar, geothermal, and wind. Those are the ones that I'm most familiar with, and we're going to talk about very briefly, and not rely on National Grid, which, by the way, is a British corporation whose business model is to import gas into England and Europe. So that's what they're going to do with this gas if they frack. So this is the first design of this vertical access wind turbine. We're working with this developer. We hope he gets a couple built this year, and then we're going to try to put one near our house. He has refined it somewhat. You probably can't see the details of this, but instead of that just initial blade here, he's put a second blade on the inside, and now there's even another generation of that. This is small. It doesn't need zoning approval. It can be put on roofs. This one travels around, and you can plug your phone into the side of that trailer here. We know about big wind. You have to be careful with big wind. Partially because of sighting, and you don't want to put them in bird migratory patterns, and migratory patterns, and also because what we've learned in some of the towns in Cortland County is that many of these companies want to build wind projects only because they make great investments and they make a lot of fees on the deal. And when you look at whether or not it will really work in the long run, they don't care because they can get it written off in a few years and then sell it. So you want to be careful of big wind. We need big wind, but we need to do it in a way that's proper and sustainable, and you want to make sure they're not trying to just do a deal. That's true of a lot of these pipeline and other projects that we see. They just want to get somebody to finance that and take their 5% off the top and then build a bigger house wherever down in the Caribbean they are. This is a geothermal heating system in our basement. I often say that most of our house is cluttered because I am not exactly a neat freak, but this is because there's a lot to this system, although it's a very elegant system. So in order to do this, the idea was to get enough of a volume of water
We had to, because we have a small lot on that lake, we had to drill down 2 wells, 350 feet. You run a closed loop, you want to be careful. There are a lot of shysters in the sustainable energy market. And so you want to be very careful what they try to sell you. We had some people try to sell us open loop systems, which are not sustainable. So this just runs a U pipe down both of those wells, brings it back up and runs it through this heat exchanger here, which is as little as I understand the physics, is essentially reverse refrigeration. And that heat difference, because it's a constant 50, 51, 52 degrees, you can heat your home with that difference. These red pipes that you can, I hope, see are radiant pipes underneath the floor. This was in the construction phase, and he has added a hot air component to it too, because that responds more quickly. Radiant heat is very slow. The other thing that, because we worked with a very knowledgeable engineer who not only designed this, but built every piece of it, every wiring, soldering, everything, he also helped us understand that if we put more insulation into the new wing that we built to put this in, that we could take advantage of passive solar. So that on days like we've had a lot of this year, where it's below 0 even, we have a south-facing front. But it's insulated well enough so that the passive solar heats the house, and we don't need any of this system working. And so that's just another thing that we need to learn, that we can build, we can retrofit old houses, there's certainly jobs there, and reduce the amount of energy that we use by very, very significant percentage. So that's just another way to try to do sustainable energy. There's no fossil fuels being used in that, but there is electricity, and that's why we're meeting tomorrow night with the same engineer to work on some solar arrays and also try to work on the wind turbine. And we know about this kind of solar array. We don't see anywhere near enough of them. And this is a study that came out a couple of years ago that indicated that we can produce, this said 80% of the electricity. There have been subsequent studies. We can produce all of the electricity that we need without burning fossil fuels and without more nukes. So this is the choice we have. We can doom our children to this, that we won't be able to use our water, or we can continue with the fossil fuel resistance that all of you, I think, most of you have a very good understanding of. So I'm sorry to preach to the choir, but I've just made it a point of making this presentation at the end of every talk I give, and we can come back if you have specific questions about towns, and I hope that's been helpful.
Thank you.